Hello, how's everybody doing? Welcome to the Tuesday morning lecture here from Chautauqua, New York, the Chautauqua Institution. Can everybody hear me well enough? If you can please send me a text to let me know, or type in the chat bar here. I'm assuming that KB is here, as well as some other people. I have Renee saying good morning. Good morning to you, Renee. It's good to see you. If you look here in the bottom right, you'll see the picture of Chautauqua Institution. This is the hotel at Chautauqua Institution. This is a great place for academics and faith. It was actually created as a summer school for Sunday school teachers who wanted more training. It was developed back in the 1890s, also for them, and to provide a college experience for people who back in the day could not go to college. It's a really amazing place. They bring in lots of scientists, lots of politicians, writers, artists, and it's a great place to sort of get your intellectual juices flowing. Everybody doing well? I see we have Donnie Hahn in the audience, Ashley Riddick, Sean John, and Alex G. Good to see everybody. So let's go ahead and get started with and we got Madison G checking in, as well as Renee Jung checking in on the cell phone this morning. Good morning to everybody. This lecture shouldn't be too long. We're going to talk a little bit about homosexuality today, so we're going to go ahead and get started on that lecture. What we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about how we describe sexual orientation. I'm going to suggest to you it's more difficult than you would think. And then we're going to spend our time, we're going to ask the question, what factors affect whether or not someone is homosexual or heterosexual. And I'm going to try to suggest to you that it's going to be more genetic and epigenetic than it is environmental. So it's not so much being brought up in one particular environment or another. You'll hear a lot of people, culture warriors who are that are against homosexuality, and a lot of times they'll say that it's something about the environment that causes it. We'll talk about that. And then I specifically want to talk a little bit about one epigenetic fact, probably the most consistent biological epidemiological effect, and that would be this idea of birth order. It seems it's one of the most reliable, consistent biodemographic correlates of sexual orientation in men. Anyhow, in men. Hey, KB, how are you doing? I don't know if you just checked in, but it's good to see you. Got a pretty good crowd here on a Tuesday morning. I'm assuming the sound is good. Everyone can hear me well enough? Hey, Madison Fitz is in the house too. Holy cow, we're getting close to having oh my goodness, we've got a huge audience today. 9 of you folks. Good to see everybody. So, so sexual orientation. Some people like to think about sexual orientation and like to label people based on their enduring sexual, emotional, or romantic attractions, right? And so we typically think of people as being heterosexual, that is interested in members of the opposite sex, or homosexual, which is romantically and sexually attracted to those people of the same sex. Your book's going to suggest it's difficult to really label people. Actually, I would argue you should never label people, but your book's going to talk specifically about the difficulty of labeling people based on sexual orientation. And your book talks about several difficulties associated with engaging in this kind of labeling behavior. The first is that people think of themselves in complicated ways. So if you ask somebody, it's not like people say I am straight or I am gay. People exist on a continuum. There are people who find both members of both sexes sexually attractive. And so you really don't get people who fall into one or another category. And if you look at the chart I have here on the on the bottom left-hand screen, you'll see that while a good majority of people describe themselves as either being completely straight or one way, but what you're going to see is a lot of people choose the second category, mostly straight or bisexual, the third category. So people don't just put themselves into one category or another category. Instead, you people have variations in preferences. Also, the book suggests that sexual attraction and sexual behavior are not necessarily one and the same. I found this kind of surprising too. I tend to think of them as being one and the same. But people may show preferences for one sex or another, but only engage in other kinds of sexual behavior. So even though you may be completely heterosexual in your behavior, you might have romantic attachments or sexual feelings towards people of the same sex. So, using this label seems to say that people's behavior and their attitudes are always consistent. And again, it's not that simple. And the third one is that these terms are based on biological labels that may not be consistent with your identification. So people don't talk about them necessarily in these simplistic terms, and so it's unfair to sort of use these to pigeonhole them. Yes, KB, I am here in New York City. Am I sounding like Venus Flytrap today? I don't know if any of you know who Venus Flytrap is. You'd have to be an old guy like me and KB to know about the smooth sounds from WKRP in Cincinnati. Okay, so here's the next slide I want to talk about. So the crazy thing is, Sigmund Freud was probably the first person to talk about sexual identity and how it was learned. And I don't want you to accept this theory. I just want you to know, for historical interests, how people used to think about sexual orientation. Good morning, Renee. In Freud's day, they thought that sexual orientation was related to whether or not you were able to identify with your same-sex parent. So Freud had this thing called the Oedipal theory, the Oedipus theory, and he argued that our first sexual attraction was actually to our mom, right? And the fear that we had of our dad finding out and castrating us as little boys caused us to identify with our father, that strong masculine figure, and adopt all of his characteristics. So Freud believed that your strong father, whom you were afraid of, caused you to identify with him, and that would cause you to develop into a heterosexual male. And he believed that weak fathers, if you had like a really strong mom and your dad was kind of a weak, ineffectual father, that you would actually identify with the stronger parent, the mother, and he thought that's how men turned out to be homosexual. Not true at all, but this represents an early belief and a persistent belief that somehow or another the environment causes people to become gay, being raised by gay parents or having a gay friend, homosexual friend. None of these things have been shown to lead to your sexuality one way or the other. So the scientific consensus would say that sexual orientation is not learned. It's either genetic or what I would call, or what is called, epigenetic. So genetic relates to the genes that you have on your genes. But as I suggested to you yesterday, your genes express themselves that cause hormones and other environmental factors in your body to kick in. These factors that are produced in your environment based on hormones, proteins, and other developmental factors are what we call epigenetic effects. And so we think that sexuality really is more affected by your genes and the processes that they kick in during the developmental process, especially, mostly the prenatal development process. So, here's the deal. Your book talks about genes. Is there such a thing as a gay gene? In the 90s, if you looked in the news, that's what they thought. People thought that people were interested in identifying this gene on the mother's X chromosome. They called it the gay gene. And the reason that this and genetic studies. So if you remember, we had those behavioral genetic studies where you look at tons of people who have different levels of genetic similarity, identical twins, fraternal twins, brothers and sisters who don't share any genetic material but are more adoptive brothers and brothers and sisters. These genetic studies have shown that there is some degree of genetic forces that affect sexuality. In fact, your book talks about a large European study with 4,000 twins in Finland, and what they suggested is that shared genetic components seem to account for about 40% of male sexuality. 20% of female, not so strong, but the genetic effect appears to be strong. There appears to be a genetic effect for sexuality, and this effect seems to be stronger for males. Now, the weird thing is, one of the findings is that gay men tend to have more gay male relatives in their family. So homosexuality in men does tend to run in families, but what they find is that this tends to run on the maternal side, and so that's what led them to this examination of the XX chromosome, because this gene seems to be related to the maternal passing of genes one way or the other. That's sort of a genetic influence, if you will. Now, the book then talks some about hormones, and they specifically, I'm going to, we'll talk about hormones. So your book does talk about hormones and how they relate to attraction. And it turns out that females who are exposed to more androgens in prenatal development tend to be more likely to grow up as a homosexual. Now, the evidence for males is not quite as direct, but it turns out that bone growth in hands and feet, which appears to be directed by the androgen hormones in the prenatal development, do show differences between long bone growth in the hands and feet, show differences between heterosexual males and homosexual males. So there is some suggestion that hormone exposure during prenatal development, the exposure to the hormone androgen, tends to affect later sexual development. Now, your book is also going to talk about brain structure. It turns out there are people who, way back in the 1950s, scientists began arguing that there was such a thing as a male hypothalamus and a female hypothalamus. In fact, when you look at, you can look in this book later in this chapter, and they'll talk about biological differences between males and females. what are the differences between males and females? And the research, although it's difficult really pinning down these differences, maybe females have a more developed corpus callosum. There is research to suggest that parts of the hypothalamus, which is responsible for motivated behavior, you remember, is larger in females than in males, larger in males than in females. And so the question becomes, do homosexual males have female hypothalamuses as opposed to male hypothalamuses? And the research does show some effect of hypothalamus size on heterosexuality. It turns out that when you give male and female hormones to heterosexual and homosexual people, so pheromones are chemicals that we put off, and we have sex pheromones that sort of attract sexual partners. And it turns out that homosexual male brains tend to activate the same areas in response to testosterone-based pheromones as do female hypothalamuses. So it looks like homosexual brains respond to the same pheromones that heterosexual female hypothalamuses respond to. And it turns out, although research has not supported the idea that there is such a thing as a female or a male hypothalamus, there is a structure in the front of the hypothalamus. I'm not even going to give you the letters to describe this cluster of neurons, but these neurons appear to be bigger in males than they do in heterosexual males than they do in homosexual males or heterosexual females. So there are parts of the hypothalamus which may be bigger in size, may show size differences between heterosexual and homosexual males, and the responses to pheromones. So there may be sort of biological differences. And remember, the growth of these organs, like the hypothalamus and other brain structures, are due to epigenetic effects during prenatal development. Okay? So let's see, back to the lecture. All right, and then I wanted to save the last one for you. Let's see, the hormones, genetics, brain structures, and mental processes. I want to spend the last couple of minutes talking about the prenatal influences of the maternal immune system. All right, and so let me go ahead and go to the next slide. Your book's going to have a little slide up here late in the chapter, and it's going to talk about this particular effect. And so, oh my goodness, fraternal birth order. So it was noticed back in the 50s, way back in 1958, that gay men tended to have lots of older brothers or lots of older siblings. And so people began to wonder if there was something that happened during a pregnancy in the mother's body that might cause this. Now, 30 years later in the 90s, they found out that it was actually not just any sibling, but it tended to be related to having lots of older brothers. Right? And so there's this weird thing called the fraternal birth order effect that suggests that for every older brother a male has, he is 25 to 50% more likely to be homosexual. Right? And so, and in fact, they suggest that probably 1 in 7 homosexual males owes their sexual orientation to this thing called the fraternal birth order effect. Now, this clearly happens in the prenatal life, so it doesn't happen during childhood or adolescence. Why do we know this? Well, because brothers who are adopted, who have lots of older brothers, don't show this fraternal birth order effect. And moreover, brothers who are adopted out of a family with lots of older brothers will still have this higher incidence of likelihood of homosexuality, even if they aren't raised with all of the older brothers. So it appears to be something that happens prenatally, right? So it seems to occur during some biological mechanism during prenatal development. So the idea is that, and the weird thing is, this only seems to happen for right-handed homosexual men. Now, the weird thing is, handedness is also something that is decided prenatally. So apparently there's some sort of prenatal mechanism that affects handedness and sexuality. And what they believe is that every time a mother has a baby, her immune system creates male-specific antigens that sort of target male hormones. And so the belief is that the more male babies a mom has, the more of these antibodies she builds up, and these antibodies cumulatively cause homosexuality. I hope I described that well enough. I'm sorry if I did not. Does anybody have any questions? So this was a short lecture. Here's the deal. Here's what I wanted you to know. It's difficult to describe sexual orientation, okay, because people exist on a varied dimension. It's not either or. Just like we talked about gender identity, it's all on this continuum. And people may find one sex or the other sex or both sexes attractive. And even though they may find these behaviors people attractive, there's a difference between attraction and behavior. So it becomes really difficult when we try to start putting labels on people's sexuality. Now, I suggested to you that although Sigmund Freud thought it had something to do with your environment and specifically not being able to identify with a weak father, the research has suggested pretty unequivocally that environment doesn't affect sexuality. Instead, it seems to be some sort of genetic or epigenetic factor. There may be a gay gene. Who knows? Mom may build up antibodies as she has males that affect sexuality. Prenatal development effects might cause brain structures that relate to sexuality to change. Nobody's really sure exactly what the causes are or what the mechanism for sexuality or heterosexuality or homosexuality is. But we do have some tantalizing clues that suggest that it has something to do with prenatal development. Does anybody have any questions? Tomorrow we're going to be talking about stress and the sympathetic nervous system. We're going to be talking about how your body responds to threats. And then hopefully I'm going to give you some advice for how you can override your body's natural fear system to control your emotions and your level of stress. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Well, if not, I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to you today. I've got some meditation to do down by the lake. And I'm going to, and I've got some reading to do, and I've also got a hard exam to make up that I'm going to get you with this weekend. But other than that, I'm going to say goodbye. It's good to see everybody. Until tomorrow, take care.